and we can help you out with that. If you have already made a gift or a grant this year, thank you so much. Your support really means the world to Madre's partners and to me. And for those of you who we are meeting for the first time, welcome to Madre. Share a little bit about our organization. We are an international feminist fund and a women and girls human rights organization. And I'm sure, as all of you have experienced, sometimes when we talk about human rights, we tend to get very focused on all of the injustices that we oppose. But I want to tell you a little bit, not just what we're against, but what Madre stands for. Madre is really a way to be part of building a just, peaceful, sustainable future. A world where all people enjoy the full range of human rights, where people have a meaningful say in policies that affect their lives, and where resources, including natural resources, are shared equitably and sustainably. Madre's actually been around since 1983, and we have, in all of that time, partnered with community-based, women-led grassroots groups who are on the front lines of war and climate disaster and what's often a very long aftermath of crisis. In our 40 years, Madre has developed over 100 partnerships in 40 countries and distributed $70 million in grants and in-kind aid with the support of many of you on this call. So thank you. Our work in crisis setting means that we operate in some really hard to reach, hard to fund places. And in order to be able to link crisis response to feminist social change, we very intentionally are working with women and girls who are some of the most marginalized people within those crisis settings. So we specifically work with 5 overlapping communities: Indigenous women, Afro-descendant women, LGBTQ people, refugees and migrants, and people with disabilities. And what we do with these partners, who are, for the most part, local, women-led organizations, is to support them in meeting very urgent needs in their communities, and at the same time, create lasting solutions to the crises that we face in the world today. So that is a bit of who we are, if you're new. And if you've been with us for some time, it's really nice to see you again, and welcome back. I know when news from around the world is as grave as it is these days, it can be hard to be hopeful about our shared future. So I want to remind us of something that Joanna Macy says, which is, the darker the circumstance, the more brilliant the invitation. And I just kind of love that. The darker the circumstance, the more brilliant the invitation. And I want to extend that invitation to each of you to stand with Madre, to stand with our partners as we build the future that all of us want to see. I'm really happy today to be joined by my awesome colleagues, Lauren Dassey and Diana Duarte. Lauren, for those of you who haven't met her yet, is Madre's Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy and has worked on gender justice and immigrant rights and social justice issues for over 20 years, done a lot of work on the US-Mexico border and in Latin America. And Diana is our Director of Policy and Strategic Engagement. She has, to my great delight, worked with us at Madre for over 17 years to advocate for human rights, peace, and justice. And Lauren, I want to ask if you could get us started and share a few highlights of our work with partners this year.
Sure, of course. Thanks, Ifat. And hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you today. And I'm here to update you on just some of the incredible work that you have made possible during this past year. Madre's relationships are truly built on trust. We value long-lasting relationships that create partnerships to advance social change and social justice for women and girls all over the world. I'm very proud to report that thanks to your support, in 2023, we awarded $4.6 million in funds in the form of 254 grants to women, girls, and members of the LGBTQ+ community all around the world. And as part of that, we've dispersed over $1 million in rapid response funds in Ukraine and Afghanistan. We also employed a participatory model of grant making that enabled our partner in Iraq, for example, to re-grant $1 million in small grants. And this is a model that we've also used in Colombia and in Haiti. And we've found that it's one of the most effective ways to get money to the grassroots, all the way to the grassroots where it's needed most. And this is just one of the many things that sets MADRE apart. So today in our time together, I'm going to update you on just 3 examples of MADRE's partnership in action in Palestine, Afghanistan, and Panama, accomplishments that women and girl leaders have made thanks again to your support. I'll first turn to Palestine. We have all been horrified watching the violence in Israel and Palestine for years, but especially now. Many of our Israeli partners, part of a wonderful group called Midwives for Peace, were personally impacted by the events of October 7th, and we have been in very, very close contact with partners in both Israel and Palestine since then. And as you know, for almost 6 weeks, there was almost no humanitarian aid getting into Gaza. But because we have relationships with grassroots groups on the inside, on the ground, MADRE was in fact able to mobilize the distribution of food, medicine, clean water, and other supplies for displaced families within Gaza. And this was when much larger international aid groups were not able to get anything through. This is a real testament to the role that local organizations play in crisis, and it's why we partner with grassroots groups who understand best how to navigate their communities and how to get aid to where it's needed most. And also, of course, when the aid corridor from Egypt finally did open up, briefly last month, I'm very, very proud to share that MADRE was able to secure 7 truckloads of food and drinking water that was distributed by our local partner groups on the ground in Gaza. And we also sent winter clothing for 7,000 children and tarps and plastic sheeting to winterize. So, for several thousand of families to winterize the tents and makeshift shelters where so many are forced to sleep right now. And I also want to highlight that MADRE is organizing a similar women-led humanitarian response in Sudan, which is so important as over 9,000 people have been killed since April in that conflict with very little media attention. Next, I want to report about MADRE's work in Afghanistan, where continuing attacks on women and girls' rights has made Afghanistan the most dangerous place in the world to be a woman. MADRE, of course, has been working in Afghanistan since the U.S. invasion in 2001. We have very, very long-standing partnerships and a deep commitment to Afghanistan. And right now, our focus is on assisting women who are under attack by the Taliban for standing up for women's rights. Women are really, really counting on MADRE for financial support, for security, and for assistance with emergency relocation if they are fleeing, for example, domestic violence or being forced into forced marriages, even if they are very young, especially if they're very young. And we're also supporting underground women's councils in Afghanistan that are being organized by groups of courageous women who are secretly organizing girls' education in defiance of the Taliban ban on education. And they're working to develop women's skills as peace builders and leaders. And finally, to close, I'd like to share a recent victory from Panama, from our partners in Panama. Estefania Cubillos is a vibrant young leader who's visually impaired, and she's a disability rights activist. MADRE has supported Estefania in forming her organization, the Association of Autonomous Women with Disabilities in Panama. More recently, MADRE was able to give Estefania's organization an emergency grant during a period of national protests against open-air copper mines in Panama. And during these protests, the costs of food and other basic necessities just shot up drastically. And that was due to shortages and road closures and the country, everybody out on the streets protesting. And women with disabilities were disproportionately impacted by these high prices and shortages. And, some were not even able to leave their homes due to lack of transportation at the time, and then also the road blockages. Estefania's organization was able to provide food, medicines, cleaning supplies, and hygiene items to women with disabilities all over the country. Now that we were supporting women with having their basic needs met, they were able to participate fully and exercise their civic duty to protest. against these polluting mines. And I'm very happy to share that Panama's Supreme Court recently sided with the people and declared the mining contract unconstitutional, which is a win that's celebrated by Estefania and the members of her organization, and also by our indigenous partners in Panama who also oppose the mine. And this one example just highlights the importance of supporting and sustaining inclusive activism and MADRE's commitment to disability justice. And so with that, I'll wrap up, and I just want to say thank you again for making this work possible. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for sharing in these accomplishments as we look towards the beginning of another impactful year together.
Thanks, Lauren. Want to just let folks know that one of the things that we hear over and over again from our grassroots partners in the kind of work that Lauren was describing is that so often the problems that they're facing in their communities, the source of those problems is actually comes from very far away from the community, right? Whether that's a situation like people in small Pacific Island countries dealing with the sort of first and worst impacts of climate change, with so little contribution to that problem, or policies that get made in Washington, D.C., or at the United Nations, or at the World Bank and IMF. What our partners tell us over and over again is that they need ways to influence these policy spaces where decisions are made that affect their communities. And so that is a vital part of our work, and the reason that we work not only at the most local level where there's so much vibrant women's organizing happening, but also making sure that that work reverberates in centers of power at the national and global levels. And Diana leads a very innovative body of work to achieve those goals on behalf of our partner groups, and would love to ask you to share a little bit more with us, Diana.
Thank you, Ifat. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. I have to say, I'm feeling a lot of appreciation for opportunities to gather like this. I think we all feel this way, that we're so busy doing the work day in and day out that it's important to have the chance to just sort of slow down and take a big breath and remind ourselves of why we're doing this. And Lauren, as I was listening to you, hearing all of those wins that MADRE grant making has made possible, that was answering the question for me. Oh yes, once again, why are we doing this? And another big reason why that I want to name is because we all share this conviction, those of us in this room and our partners around the world, that building the world that we want to see is still possible, and that together we can find a way to get there. And I'll confess that in a lot of recent weeks and months, there have been moments where I find that I've been holding my breath without realizing it. And I think that's because we've all been confronted over and over again by such terrible crises and more terrible news, from the war on Gaza to the war in Sudan and continued examples of climate breakdown. It's easy to feel like you're constantly like bracing yourself for what might come next. And, what's more, I think especially in the policy and advocacy work, as Ifat was just mentioning, we know that so many of these crises that we're seeing have their roots in the realm of policy and in the decisions that policymakers are making. And so it's difficult then to see the ways that our policies are frankly, failing the needs of humanity. But in those moments when I realize, oh, I'm doing it again, I'm holding my breath, there are a few things that do help me to, let me breathe easier, let me say, and that energize me to take the next step. And that is recognizing that just as the roots of crisis often lie in policy, so do their solutions, and that those solutions are available to us, that we can build better and more just and more feminist policies across peace and climate issues. And that the solutions that we need have been honed over many years by feminist organizers for peace and justice around the world in the networks that MADRE partners are part of, and here in the US in a lot of the communities that we each are also part of. And so what we need to do and what we can do is bridge the gap between those feminist solutions that we need and the policymakers who need to implement them. And so that's the work that we do through MADRE's Feminist Policy Jumpstart We bring the voices of grassroots feminist partners, many of whom are leading the work that Lauren just described. We bring those voices into the US policy arena. And that can look a few different ways. That can mean educating US policymakers about the impacts of the decisions that they're making in communities worldwide and advocating then for change in those policies. And it can also mean bridging between global grassroots feminists and US social movements to help, combine our voices, combine our pressure for political change. And so I want to share a few examples of what has been the impact of that work and what it looks like today. And I'll start off by talking about climate policy, and not only because that's one of the most grave global threats that we all face, but because there's also been breaking news in this arena. You all may have seen that the COP, the annual UN climate conference, just wrapped up. And for the first time ever, the outcome document from that conference includes language that says that we need to transition away from fossil fuels, and states have agreed to that. And, caveats apply. There are loopholes in the document, and there certainly will be major difficulties in implementing that. But nonetheless, this is an incredibly important win that was up until the last minute of the negotiations not even assured, and that would not have been possible without years of organizing and advocacy. And so MADRE's contribution to that collective effort has been our years of supporting and resourcing the voices of Indigenous and rural feminist partners in international and national climate advocacy spaces, including in a delegation of partners who were there in Dubai for this very climate conference that just wrapped up. The context of all of this is that we know that the harms of the fossil fuel era have not been evenly distributed. They've hit the hardest in the frontline communities of many of our partners worldwide. And in our grant making, we've worked to equip women leaders with the tools and the resources that they need to save lives through climate disaster and to help people build more resilient communities. But part of that resourcing also means creating spaces where these frontline feminist leaders can exchange expertise and create shared strategies. And so, for instance, we've partnered with rural and Indigenous women worldwide who are confronting the harms of oil, gas, mining, as Lauren was just mentioning, in Panama, and other extractive industries. So in places like Panama, Colombia, Kenya, Nepal. And we bring those partners together, whether it's on a delegation to Indigenous communities in North Dakota who've been confronting the health impacts of fracking, or to the United Nations here in New York, or in opportunities to engage with US policymakers, or in many virtual exchanges that we've hosted for our partners. And in each of those instances, each of those spaces we create, our partners are able to exchange resistance and advocacy strategies, from legal advocacy to youth organizing to data gathering and beyond. And then they build their relationships and they build their shared power. So when I see news like what came out of the COP this year, I think about all that contributed to that leverage that we needed to build to force action from policymakers. And it was in those sort of small moments, those moments of exchange and relationship building and creating a broader base of power that our partners and that MADRE's work has been part of. And I'll also say that if anyone is interested to connect and discuss about what this work looks like moving forward, what will it look like to continue to amplify feminist voices who are confronting fossil fuels, but also to envision what comes next. How can we give policymakers a roadmap to a more just and feminist energy future? I'm happy to, continue that conversation with anyone who's interested. And the last example that I'll share is from our peace building work. In our work recently to advocate for a ceasefire in Gaza. You just heard Lauren referring to our grant-making emergency response and how we focus so much on being able to save lives. And that priority also extended to our policy work, where we've joined a collective effort to demand a ceasefire and a US foreign policy that's aligned with human rights and peace. And in our outreach to congressional offices, we not only pointed to the broad and devastating human impacts of this war, the incredible loss of life and the destruction of entire communities, but also the ways that this continued violence that has been supported by the US, pushes the prospects of peace for Palestinians and Israelis further away. So, and we also underscored the ways that women in Palestine and Israel have been standing together for peace for decades, and that hope and trust that represents is the seed that we have to continue to nurture. So as the pressure for ceasefire here in the US and globally continues to grow, we're asserting at the same time that safety and human rights for Palestinians and Israelis are mutually interdependent. And in our continued work to demand a more progressive and feminist foreign policy, those values of collective well-being and care will continue to be central. Those are the values and the grounding that we keep coming back to, whatever new crises may arise. They're the values that we share with grassroots feminist partners worldwide who are, co-creating the world that we want to live in. And when I look ahead to the new year, I'm grateful and energized to know that whatever challenges are coming, we'll be able to face them together with you all and with our partners as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I'm appreciating you just kind of like highlighting the ways in which our work really flows from a wellspring of feminist values. And I think that that is really is our North Star, and how we guide our work and make decisions about what to do with finite resources, staff, abilities, that we have. And it's making me think about something that we've talked about a little bit on staff, which I'm sure is not lost also for many of you on this call, which is that part of the success of the right wing in this country has been their funding model. Since the Reagan years, the right has been funding not discrete one-off projects with all kinds of restrictions and caveats. They have funded in this really expansive way ideas, institutions, leaders. And that is very much what MADRE is doing. We make sure that there are strong, vibrant feminist organizations at the most local level where violations are actually happening against women's rights and where the majority of women organize, which is in their communities. We make sure that feminist values, as Diana spoke about, the feminist values we see are animating public policies in this country and globally, and that those feminist values are respected and upheld and slowly but surely also normalized, right? That we have this concept now of feminist foreign policy. It still is very contested what that means, and people can put all kinds of things in that container. It still is, I have to say, not taken seriously across the board in the mainstream by policymakers. But I can feel over the past 6 or 7 years the ratcheting up of the global understanding of the need for that, for policies rooted in care, for example, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic. And I think one of the benefits of having an organization that has seen a lot of history is that we can chart some of that and use that progress to kind of refuel hope in difficult moments. And we are really working to make sure also that feminist leaders who are grounded in communities and in movements are resourced and supported to make the changes that all of us want to see. So I would love to reserve a big chunk of our time just to have some more free-flowing conversation with everybody. And I think Adriana is gonna help us out with a little bit of Q&A. If people have questions or comments, you're welcome to come into the space and have some conversation.
Thank you, Yvette, and thank you, Diana and Lauren, for all the things that you've said. We do have a few questions that have come in, and I would encourage anybody else to share in the Q&A box down below. The first one is, can you talk about how you identify your partners in various locations? What's the process? Are there new locations under consideration for funding? And how are those grassroots leaders identified?
Yeah, thanks. I could take a crack at that. Diana and Lauren, feel free to jump in. I will say that for the most part, how we identify our partners is pretty organic. For an organization that has been around for a long time, we have many and very deep relationships. And so usually it's our ongoing long-term partners who will point us to like a new nascent group that they think is really fantastic. So that's one way. Another is that what we experience all the time is growing demand for our programming. So people in a community, adjacent to a place where we have done a lot of programming will all of a sudden see that as a result of the intervention that this local women's group has done with MADRE, rates of forced early marriage or domestic violence or young boys being recruited into armed groups are all trending in the right direction, going way down. And then they will ask our partners, how did you all achieve this in your community? And the answer is, well, we've been working with MADRE on these programs. And so then, people come to us and ask us to expand our work into their communities. And of course, we have to make choices about partners, and the way that we decide who to work with is really, and this is sometimes a little counterintuitive to people, it's not so much based on the degree of the need. Need, of course, is everywhere, unfortunately. Really, because what we're doing is working for feminist social change, we're choosing people who share the vision of the world that we want to live in, that vision that I was talking about at the top of our call. And that doesn't mean that our partners are like political clones of all of us. We do, we can have debates, we can learn from each other and change positions on different things. But you all know this, like you kind of like recognize yourself in another person when it comes to, how you want to live, how you want the world to be. And when we experience that with a grassroots groups that is new to us, we try to bring them into the circle of support that MADRE builds.
Can I just add a word to that answer as well? Just thinking a little bit about the policy advocacy work that we do, is that we often find ourselves in coalition spaces or movement spaces where people, find each other because we have a shared political demand. So that's certainly been true in the climate policy work that I was just describing, that there are very locally rooted networks, and now increasingly, transnational networks of feminists who are coming together, who are finding each other and trying and creating coalitional homes for ourselves to be able to join our power to make a particular political demand. And so that's one way as well that we're able to be in network and find new potential partners, people that we might want to work with on policy campaigns, or maybe have other points of interaction as MADRE with those organizations.
Yeah, and just to address the second part of the question about new locations under consideration, we tend to organize, we don't tend to organize our work solely by geography. And that's partly because, as Diana was saying, we work in a lot of coalitions. We know that, when you have goals as visionary as ours around eradicating gender-based violence, creating climate justice, building just peace, no one organization is going to achieve that for the world, right? And we really see ourselves as working as part of an ecosystem of a lot of other great groups. Many of them are probably among the groups that you all support, which is fantastic. And we rely very much on our sort of sister organizations to move an agenda, and we try as much as we can to work well in coordination with them, to collaborate where that makes sense. And to have a rational division of labor so that we're not creating big gaps. And so our decision to prioritize working with those 5 overlapping communities that I mentioned at the top of our call was really a result of a kind of assessment with a lot of other feminist funders, where we concluded that the organizing principle of where we work wasn't so much around geography, but around which groups really needed to be brought in and lifted up in terms of voice and leadership in the spaces where we operate. So that's sort of our approach to that.
And I just wanted to thank you both so much, Ifat and Diana, for responding. And I just wanted to add a concrete example of partners introducing us to other potential partners. Last August, I was in Colombia with the team, and we were doing a series of trainings and meetings about our gender persecution campaign, which is a powerful tool that we have to end gender-based violence and for accountability. And we had invited members of other organizations that were newer to MADRE, And during one of the coffee breaks, everyone's interacting and having organic conversations. And some of our long-term partners of PCN, a group of Afro-Colombian women activists, were there, and they were talking about the amazing work that they're doing documenting gender-based violence. And there were members from a National Indigenous Women's Congress who were there, and they talked to him during the break and said, how did you, start documenting? How did you learn about human rights? We want to do more, reports to treaty bodies. We want to get more involved in Colombia's transitional justice process. And they said, oh, well, MADRE's been supporting us for years. And so then they found us during the next break and asked us to, conduct some trainings with them. And just last week, we were able to do the first of a training on human rights in general and human rights documentation with this amazing group of Indigenous women activists from all over the country of Colombia.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Peggy.
All right, we have another question, and thank you for your thorough answer of the first. This one is, what do you see as hopeful pathways for influencing the policy choices in Israel and Gaza?
Yeah, that is such an important question right now. And I think that to me, the most hopeful pathways are the ideas and the actions and values and assertions that we're hearing right now from Israeli and Palestinian peace activists. This is a rough moment to take a stand for peace in both of those societies. I think we have a little taste of that in terms of the cacophony that we're all experiencing in our own networks and in the public here in the United States, and it's much, much more intense, from inside of those two geographies. And what to me is the most hopeful thing is that despite all of it, everything that's been going on for decades in those communities, there are people in both of those societies who are holding fast to each other's humanity and have really rejected the premise that comes certainly from this super right-wing Israeli government that's been in power for the last year, but also from a lot of the Palestinian national factions, among them Hamas, that are telling people that, that Israelis or Palestinians, that's your enemy. And there are people in both societies who reject that and who understand that this isn't just a war between Israel and Hamas, that this is a confrontation between people who think that peace can be achieved through violence and domination versus people who understand what Diana was talking about before, which is the incredibly, just the mutuality and the interdependence of Israeli and Palestinian safety and security. And I think when folks in those countries who are starting from that premise and who understand that, there is not going to be security for Israelis without peace, and there is not going to be peace for Palestinians without freedom, that premise is the beginning of the pathway to hope. And there is a long, long way to go. But I think what's really important for those of us who are in this country, and certainly I feel this responsibility at MADRE, is to be working to lift up those voices, because it's our job as progressives to make common cause, not with other governments or even leaderships of different kind, but with other progressive people around the world, and to find them and find ways to reach out and support them and lift up their voices. And I think that we're actually in the early stages of starting to feel sort of the shift in our own government's stance on that, with President Biden coming out and using the word indiscriminate to describe the Israeli assault on Gaza, which every human rights lawyer in the world has been saying that, since day one of this bombing. So I do think that there is some hope moving forward. And we have to keep on doing what we're doing and protect people who are most in danger, first of all, and keep that vision of peace moving forward as we're doing the humanitarian part.
I would also just like a PS quickly to what you were saying, Ifat, just on the theme of uplifting voices who are holding fast to that vision and making common cause with progressives in different spaces. As somebody who works a fair amount in sort of like the progressive policy space here in the US, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity there, maybe more than we've seen in many, many years, for there to be progressives sitting inside of US Congress who want to have that kind of engagement and who want to transform US foreign policy so that it's not sort of locked into the default settings that we've seen for so long, but that we can envision something new and different, that, you know, that we're not just sort of like on the outside shouting in, but there are new voices, new stakeholders inside of US progressive policymaking that I think that we can find hope in that. Obviously, it's not perfect and it's always very complicated and people make compromises and disappoint us. All those caveats apply as well. But I think that in terms of being able to move forward and take steps incrementally forward towards transforming US foreign policy, which we know is so involved in this crisis, that feels like a channel of hope for me.
Yeah. And I'll just say too, you know, I think, you know, some of us on this call are like old enough to remember that we didn't always used to have feminist allies in, you know, centers of power. And we I think have spent a really long time kind of knocking on the outside of the door trying to be let in. And the fact that, you know, there are people inside, whether we're talking about Congress or the United Nations or, you know, other governments that are the national governments of our own partners, you know, we do have some allies, not as much as we need or want, but we do have some allies inside. And so I think that's a strategy that's available to us. You know, sometimes activists call it like an insider-outsider strategy. But that is another important part of the work and the way that we are working to sort of build the capacity of people who share our values, who are doing that work from inside of policymaking spaces, and to really make sure that they understand what the real life impact of US government policies are in faraway places where they may not, if not for MADRE and our partners, they might not have a way to hear directly from rural women in Yemen, for example, about, you know, what US support for Saudi Arabia has meant over the past 6 years. So really important piece also of the work that Lauren and Diana are moving.
Thank you both. Our next question is, what is the biggest funding gap right now and challenges MADRE faces as a feminist grantmaker?
Again, I can start and curious to see if Lauren and Diana, if you have different ideas, but you know what comes to mind for me is what I was saying before about the trend in progressive philanthropy that happily we are starting to see change, which is about funding individual projects, but not funding the kind of infrastructures that we need to move the work forward. And so for us, what always is the biggest challenge is having sort of what's called general operating money that isn't like earmarked for a really discrete purpose. And as much as we need to ensure that we can get money to this place or that place, or for this partner or that partner, what gives us the most flexibility and also capacity to plan and be as responsive as our partners need us to be is to have money that isn't designated for a specific purpose, but that we and our partners can decide, sometimes on a dime, right? Because we're trying to move money quickly much of the time. And so when we have that kind of general support, it enables us to be responsive immediately. It enables us to fill gaps in ways that are really important. You know, Lauren was talking before about what a huge crisis there is in Sudan right now. And how little media attention there's been on it. It's really hard to raise money for a crisis that isn't in the news. But when we have the trust of our own donors to kind of make decisions about how we're deploying grants, that is really, really valuable to our partners. And it often is the biggest funding gap that we have, is that category of general money that we can make decisions with.
I just want to share, as somebody who is not on the grant making team, but I have the privilege of having a front row seat to witness a lot of the work of the grant making team and the feminist funding practices that MADRE puts into play. One thing that I'm always struck by and impressed by is the way that we have certainly our networked relationships with our own partners, but that when we think about doing feminist grant making, we're also trying to work in coordination and in an ecosystem with other grant makers, so that when there are major crises in the world or major priorities that we want to be able to address. I'm thinking, for example, of some of the work that we've done to resource the organizing of young feminists around the world, that has been a very joint effort with others in the philanthropic space, and that we're able to identify priorities and move money, not only as MADRE, but in a cohort of other funders that I just find really impactful, because it shows that we're able to build a stronger whole to meet the needs of a wider array of people.
All right, and this is probably one of our last questions, if not the last. But what is the difference between your work, MADRE's work, and other women in feminist orgs?
I can name a couple of things. You know, I think one of the things that distinguishes us as a feminist grant maker is that we also have this very elaborated human rights advocacy program that is quite unique, and we developed that work because of what I was saying before, that our partners really wanted not just to be able to do the community organizing and the rapid response to crisis that is really about kind of bringing folks back from the brink of survival in many cases, but they wanted to make sure that that work was not like just like pushing a rock up the hill just to have it, you know, come back down. And humanitarian aid, even life-saving aid, sometimes feels like a band-aid if we're not doing the work to address the underlying causes that are creating that crisis in the first place. And so one of the best tools that we have found along with the policy work that Diana was describing, is really using the international human rights system as a kind of activist toolkit. And not, you know, not as like a sort of like mechanistic or legalistic checklist, like did this government like, you know, meet all these things, but really seeing like how it can function in the hands of activists as a way to create accountability and demands for the kinds of policies and protections that women and girls are asking for in so many of the places where we work. So that program that Lauren leads is very, very unique to MADRE. And often it's a sort of like added thing that we can contribute in some of the coalitions that Diana was describing when we're working with other feminist grant makers. One other thing that is distinctive about MADRE is that we are, and it's related to that, you know, we're working both to meet really urgent needs of the kind Lauren was describing, and with this long-term vision of change. And so I think that is part of how we do kind of feminist crisis response, is to make sure that, you know, we're not replicating some of the deficiencies and kind of reproducing some of the frankly colonial dynamics that we've seen in the way in the international aid architecture has been set up. And so, you know, I think we've all seen some of the unintended, really negative consequences of how aid can work, including kind of creating sort of passivity and dependence in communities that are receiving aid, undermining local economies, because we do things like fly in genetically engineered rice from Texas to some country in Africa and then distribute it for free so that local farmers can't sell their own rice, even if just a couple of hours away from a place where there are food shortages, people are harvesting food, which I've seen for myself in Kenya, for example. So, we do a lot of experimentation, things like making sure that we are wherever we can, and we've done this recently in Gaza, but also we've done it in East Africa, sourcing organically grown, locally grown food aid from our partners, and then leveraging grant-making dollars to procure their supplemental produce and allow organizations on the ground to distribute that as humanitarian aid, so that it really, communities have the experience of designing and leading and implementing the actual distribution that people see in the community, that local women's organizations are the ones who are meeting their very urgent need. That is a way to create protection for women's organizations in a time when right-wing authoritarian actors, unfortunately, not just among big governments, but also in some local communities, are really oppositional to women's rights agendas and to local women's organizing. And it gives the community a sense of like that they're actually able to meet their own needs. And a lot of dynamic and creative organizing has flowed from some of those initiatives. So it's yes, we're doing crisis response and emergency grant making, but we're doing it with an eye towards building out the kind of communities that people really want to be living in.
All right, we do have a few more minutes before we're going to close. So I will prompt you guys with one of the new year is right here around the corner. So going into the new year, what is MADRE aiming for? Is there any highlights of just 2024?
Lauren and Diana, you want to take that?
Yeah, I can start. I feel like 2024 is going to be one for the books. And I think there's a lot of openings, opportunities, political opportunities that we can anticipate, that we want to seize and work with our partners, resource our partners, and mobilize with them to seize those opportunities. I mentioned the one about the sort of increasing sense of urgency and possibility at the level of climate policy. And it's like the flip side of the coin of people feeling like we're constantly in crisis, right? It means that there's that we all agree that this is a global priority, that we're feeling it in our home communities, and that our policymakers have a responsibility to act, and we're putting increasing pressure on them. So I feel like on the climate policy question, we're going to see a lot of opportunities for motion in the work that I was describing earlier on giving policymakers a roadmap to a more just and feminist energy future. That's going to be a big focus. And when I think about the broader work of building peace and confronting militarism in U.S. foreign policy, that is something that has been part of MADRE's reason for being since the very beginning. When we were founded in the early 80s, it was because we saw what our government was doing in communities, first in Central America, but then in other places around the world as well. And we came to be because we wanted to be a vehicle for not only accountability here at home, but solidarity with those communities that were directly impacted. And I think we're reaching another moment of sort of potential sea change, where there's communities and social movements here in the US who are increasingly invested in the vision of a transformed US foreign policy and seeing that as connected to our futures right here at home. So I do think that even amidst the crises, the flip side of that is that we are ready to be in solidarity with each other. So when I think of 2024, that's what I think of.
And I'll just say, I know we're almost out of time, but just building off of the wonderful work that we've been doing together, but, connection, hope, supporting and connecting and partnering, true partnership with our partners on the ground all over the world, and just incredible, especially when I think of all of the amazing ways that MADRE is able to get funds in incredibly hard to reach places. And that's what really inspires me as, someone who's fortunate enough to be part of the MADRE team and also a donor myself to MADRE. And I'm just so grateful for all of the work that we do together.
Yeah, and I'll share one quick thing as more of a teaser. I'm not going to get into it, but I look forward to sharing more with you about this in the new year. It's a preview. We are going to be launching with our really fantastic partner organization in Haiti, a group called the Haitian Women's Collective, the first ever Haitian Women's Fund next year. So I look forward to sharing more about that in the new year. And just really appreciate all of you for joining us today to hear about what your support makes possible. I think everybody on this call understands that women and girls often bear kind of the burden of care in times of emergency and the brunt of climate disaster and of war. But women are also drivers of lasting change and real visionaries for solutions to the world's biggest challenges. And I think one of the things that we experience all the time is that wherever we work, Haiti, Colombia, Sudan, the Philippines, you name it, they're just at the forefront of helping to rebuild and reimagine a more peaceful, sustainable world. So thank you for building that future with us. And if you are wondering what more can be done right now, I want to encourage you around 3 quick things, which is to please make a gift before the end of the year if you haven't already. Help us spread the word about MADRE's work to your friends, to your family. We're happy to come to you to speak at events or at informal gatherings. And please stay in touch with us on social media. Thank you very, very much for being with us today. And I want to wish everybody peace and a really, really wonderful new year. Thanks.
Thank you all. That is the end. And so I will leave you, and I'll leave this up for a second. And that is all. And a happy new year soon.